Hello, everyone. This is episode 32 of High Fantasy, member of the Broken Charts Network. And has anyone been productive in the past 2 weeks? Because we're staying on schedule.
Yes, a bit. Things are going slow. I got rejected by the editor, shocker, or publishing company. So written a bit more in Andromeda's Love, trying to get that done. We're kind of in the home stretch in terms of story. Like we've got one more big scene, and then it's all like, then it's to the end. So we're trying to plan that out and figure things out.
What is this
Uh,
whole home stretch and done and what are you talking about?
Well,
Ending?
done is a relative term because then we got to go back and edit and rewrite and all sorts of other stuff. So, yeah, it'll be a little while before we're done. But what can you do?
I wrote 116 words. I just looked, but
Nice.
it's something. I'm trying to I've rewritten the start a couple times, just trying to get the right tone I want.
That's hard.
Once you figure it out, it goes a little quicker, but hopefully
Yeah.
I'll get there.
Right.
It
So
is
you
time
you
sink.
you kept 116 words. You've probably written like 1,500, 2,000, just the same 116 to 10, 12 times.
Same
Lord
way.
knows I've done that. I've only made or one time I rewrote 10,000 words and ended up with an extra 7. So in word count, it was only +7, but the entire section was a lot better. So it just kind of depends on how you want to look at the whole, word counts.
I have been working slowly on the outline for the Victorian story. Yes, last week was much more productive than this week because it seems like only Saturdays are when I'm able to work on it. And I had the point that I need to start world building again because I need to know people's names and positions in society. It's shit.
That's the fun thing. I love making up
I hate
societies.
names. There's nothing more I hate than coming up with names. I'm terrible at it. I am awful at it.
Yeah, I feel like they're always shit when I sit there and start making people's names
so
up.
many times it's just sci-fi name and it'll pull up a generator or something. I was just yeah, that one. Just put it in there.
My issue is because it's not a fantasy setting, not entirely. It's in England. It's I need to find English names that somehow fit. I'm worried if I just choose something that's that's way too common for a noble or vice versa, and just So that's a little.
Just go with the old
frustrating.
small letter houses.
There's a really good name generator out there where you can go you can pick ancient world, medieval Europe, Africa, New World, and from that you can do all sorts of different sub names. So it's if you search John name editor,
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
it's pretty good, and you can get really just different stuff with it. So
Yeah, I should have to play with that one. Actually, I have it saved, and I have a bunch of name or generators that I use at various points, and that's one of them.
see, he's got a really good dungeon creator for D&D. So I've used that quite a bit, and in random encounters or treasures or whatnot. So that's what I use it for. I'm oh, this guy's got a name editor. This guy's got too much time on his hands. Thank you.
Oh, he's got a Cthulhu Mythos name generator. Nice.
Yeah, so it's I recommend his stuff. I am no way affiliated with it. I just recommend it because I like using it.
All right, so our topic for today is unintended consequences of characters or world building or authors. Unintended.
Right. So we've all, at least I've been there, where we hit this point we keep going down the rabbit hole, and we're okay, well, I have this family, and you just keep going backwards in time. Oh, we need to know what happened here, or this object. You're oh, we need to know everything. So you just keep going backwards and backwards and backwards and backwards and backwards. Then all of a sudden you've gone super far in all these directions, and you haven't written anything. And you don't know where to start or where to stop with your story. So that's sort of, when I think about unintended consequences, unintended consequences of decisions you make and how far you need to go back, when you're explaining things.
yell about George R. R. Martin and his insistence on only writing about Targaryen history for the past 5 years and putting out a whole book about Targaryen history and the history of the world of the Song of Ice and Fire. And then apparently there was some generations of Targaryens that didn't get enough attention, so he just wrote a whole new book about those guys and is putting that one out.
Oh.
But
Fun.
we still don't have the next book.
Wow. I didn't know of that.
Yeah, it's Fire and Fury or something. No, that's that other book. Fire and Ice.
Right.
Something.
I saw something like that. It was a headline. It was like, yes, there's a new Game of Thrones book, but no, it's not the next book. And like all the comments were just fire. They were so pissed.
Like at some point, you've got to write the next book. Yes,
Right.
history of your story is fun, but you're telling a story, not the history.
I mean, that's what people hope, but
That's what people hope.
I mean, is that what Tolkien did? Sort of. He did tell a story. He succeeded in that. He told a couple, actually, but we have so much more.
It's the Silmarillion.
Yeah,
There's
things
a
like
few
that.
stories.
A lot of the history were in separate books. Like
Yeah, he gave us the whole series at once.
right, and then he went back and started writing other things.
I guess he kind of wrote it all at the same time.
I mean, he did succeed in actually finishing the story, but he also spent quite a lot of time and paper on stuff that you had no idea you needed to know, and you probably didn't need to know.
I thoroughly enjoyed the Silmarillion, even if there was a lot of stuff in there that didn't make much sense. But I had already read the full trilogy.
It didn't make sense, because maybe that's an unintended consequence.
Not that it doesn't make sense. It's just so much, and you're like, okay. Some stories are more interesting and seemingly relevant than others.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Lord of the Rings trilogy was released between 1954 and 1955. All 3 books.
That's impressive.
And The Hobbit was in 37. So it looks like he just wrote them all and they're like, these books are too big. So we got.
Yeah, I know that he was actually pissed off at the fact it needed to be 3 books. He wanted it released as 1.
Right. And then there was some more stuff in like 62, 74.
So does that count as an unintended consequence? Your book needs to be 3 books because you wrote too much?
Could be. I mean, yeah, you start out too grand, build too big of a world with too many characters, or have part of the issue is he starts pretty much at the beginning, right? Like there's a lot of traveling, there's a lot of, Sauron is building his powers, there's a lot of stuff going on.
Bilbo's 111th birthday is like 100 and something pages long.
Are you kidding me?
I'm pretty sure that first chapter is very long.
Yes.
Anything actually
remember trying
happens.
to read it. Granted, I was rather young, and I couldn't get through the.
I just made a
Hobbit
mistake
part.
that is an unintended consequence of the way the book was published. I just said it was a good series. It was 1 book, but because they were forced to publish it as 3, everyone looks at it as a series.
Yep.
Right. Yep. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that can be an unintended consequence.
Didn't Sanderson break the publishing method for Words of Radiance?
Words of Radiance. It had to. Each copy of the book had to go through the machine twice. There was huge articles about this, kind of showing this is how it comes out the first time, and it's several inches thick. It has to go through again, add another couple inches, and then it gets hardbound and stuff.
And then England does a smart thing, and typically Europe in general publishes it as 2 novels. Not that I want to buy it twice, but
no, it's how do you make an ending in there? Well, an unintended consequence of this form is so the Kingkiller Chronicles, Patrick Rothfuss, and he actually wrote the entire story. Then he got published, and they decided, no, it has to be in multiple books, and he wanted to do it in 1, I think, or I could be misremembering. But the point is, he wrote the entire story, and now we are still waiting for the 3rd book.
Didn't he outlined the entire story or something, and then
he had everything.
He had everything set up, went to the publisher, and I imagine he probably did some rewriting of the first book when it was published. But then he changed so much in the course of the first and second books that it ruined the outline.
Certainly things like that, like one of the more popular characters, Auri, she wasn't in that originally. She was made, and now she has her own standalone book.
That's what happens when you have compilation series.
Pantsers. Outlines.
Or pantsers.
I'm sorry. I have a prejudice, but...
You don't say.
Yeah.
I think that is just with the things of authors doing these collaborative efforts. So you've got like the God knows Dresden writes enough Butcher writes enough short stories for various publications, but because you give the authors chances to write outside the narrative, it lets them build characters that might otherwise not have had as much depth.
Yeah.
Right, but you got to be careful with that in terms of, if you're going to have those short stories and side stories, not making them critical to the story, right, and to the character development. And, because a lot of people either won't search them out or don't know they're there. And so if someone's like, hey, if he references a short story in the main series of books this person's been reading, they're going to be like, what happened here? And so that's a weird balance to strike between character building and all this other stuff, and also keeping it in line with the same story, that you don't need to know that information for it to make sense.
Like if you look at Dresden, if you just read the main series, you would never hear the idea of the Oblivion War.
Right.
Dresden would never hear about it. It's just never going to come up.
It's very clever, though.
Yeah.
In terms of the Oblivion War, you're going to mention it, do it that way.
Yeah.
It's the Oblivion War.
I guess that's an unintended consequence when it comes to Malazan and the way they structured that, in that, like, Erickson wrote his 10-book series focusing on a certain section, but references things that happens in the other series because they're important world building. But if you didn't read them, then you kind of just feel left hanging.
Mm-hmm.
Like a major character died off screen between books that you wouldn't have known if you don't go out and read the other books what happened. Major side character that doesn't really show up on page. But like, it's weird that he would even mention it in the main series when it was something that happened on screen somewhere else. It adds confusion when it doesn't need to be.
Yeah, don't add confusion.
Especially when you're infamous for being confusing.
Yeah.
Then you have the whole idea of like finding the middle ground. This is true for stories in general. Like, we are a certain type of people where we want to know everything about everything, but a lot of readers, they don't. They just want to read the story, and that's cool. So you got to be careful that you don't have the unintended consequences of writing too much and boring somebody who doesn't really care about all these little details and really just cares about the characters in the story.
Yeah, if you have a fixation on mechanical details of like weapons or something, you're going to bore people who just don't care. I want the pretty fights. Okay.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm reading a biography about Washington, and Chernow is fantastic when it comes to detail, and he'll talk about like different qualities and then show traits that Washington, like letters from Washington where he talks about like the number of bushels of wheat or whatnot. And it's like, it's extremely minute detail. And for me, it doesn't bother me, but I can see that some people would be turned off by the amount. It's backing up the research, but it's so much extra word.
So for the Dresden episode last week about Lovecraft, I had read At the Mountains of Madness. And it took me several months to get through it because at certain parts it was just like travel. It was these characters going through the city that shouldn't exist in Antarctica and describing every single detail. I didn't need to know all of those details because a lot of them were unimportant until later. And he could have done it a lot better. And then there's just even things about, yes, it was a research expedition. They took a lot of tools. I don't need to have all of them listed at me.
But the person writing it would have written all the tools.
But he didn't even use them. No, not in the context of what he was writing. No, he wouldn't
In the
have written all
context of a story, he wouldn't have written all that. But Lovecraft tended to like to write extremely in the head of the narrator.
But in the story of At the Mountains of Madness, the guy was saying, "Don't go there because it's dangerous." The details of what he took and what he did not use was not important. What he took and did use is, but not the 13 things he didn't use. Okay, it's very
Be careful
tiring.
being too detailed.
Right. Yeah, you got to be really careful with that, and like, because it's so easy, at least for me, to just, like I said, just kind of go in every direction, and then like, and then not be able to write anything. Because I mean, I ran into this with Corlex, which I'm still working on, and I need to actually like finish again because I'm on my 4th rewrite. Like the time started over again, but like every time I do it, I think of more things, and I just keep going farther and farther back when I start, and I don't know if that's a good thing. Like,
Probably not.
there's all these things that are important, but I'm not exactly sure how to reference them without being over. Like, I mean, you can always do the flashback, which is one way to do it, or like some kind of tangential referencing that eventually gets explained down the road. So, like, every time I think about this story, I want to start farther back on the timeline. And so that's one of those unintended consequences of, building this world. Like, I feel like I need to write an entire book that's not even dealing with the main character, that's just talking about the history of the fucking world, when I don't need to do that. Because there's so many, there's government bodies and all these things that like are important to the story and how people interact with the environment, and different planets being under different rules will have these different features and different things. And so I'm just like, I don't know where to start, and I just end up just staring at the computer for an hour, then going and playing Dota because I couldn't think of anything to write. So I mean, that's my issue is, are y'all familiar with the turtles all the way down, that expression?
I know Discworld.
Yeah, that's kind of where it comes from, but it's a writing thing of, so I just keep looking for the bottom, and there is no bottom. It's just more turtles, and that's my issue with writing and world building. Like that's probably my biggest issue is I have like I just keep on going, and so that's why I tend to not world build as much, is because if I start world building too much, I just keep going, and then I don't know where to write and where to put everything, and I just kind of die. So that's one of my issues.
That's kind of like the opposite problem that most authors tend to have with their stories is, I don't know if it was Sanderson in a lecture or something, but most people start too early.
Yes.
And they need to start closer to the action.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
know Alex and I got into an argument with where I wanted to start my story, and we'll see if that turns out. But to go back further and start further back usually is probably never a good idea.
I mean, with my Victorian story, I know like it has to start when she gets out of the asylum, because that's when she has the ability to make things happen. So I'm kind of doing almost retrospectively. I need to make things happen closer to that moment versus her story starting later. So like, I mean, maybe like in terms of like what year or month I put it in, that might change or something, but I just need to make sure that those events are close enough that it's not too boring in between. But I know it has to start when she gets out.
Yeah, like I was just working on the start of that story, and I realized if he's coming back from a transoceanic journey by ship, I don't have the luxury of starting at the season I want, because that journey only would have happened at a certain time of year.
Yeah.
So I have to start at a certain point, because that's where my narration decided to start.
Right.
Yeah,
and
it's weird.
And that is one of those things where if you are doing a story that follows our calendar more closely in terms of holidays and those kind of things, if you, depending on when you start your story, you might have to deal with stuff that may or may not may or may not have to deal with at another time. You know, I mean, I know it's done on purpose, but there's several books around Dresden that are around Halloween, so that has special things, and but even in the real world, that has special connotations. Christmas, special connotations, Easter, et cetera, et cetera.
When I did my reread of Dresden, I realized how, like, I read those books the first time so quickly that my impression was that most stories happened around Halloween. I was surprised in my reread how few of them were actually around Halloween.
So, like 2 or 3 of them that are kind of in that. I mean, Deadbeat's the only one that's like specifically on Halloween, right? But there's some that are around there.
Cold Days.
Cold Days, yeah.
Cold Days, right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then Grave Peril takes place in like earlier October, so it was still being affected by the idea of Halloween, but not on Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
I was just found it strange that the impression of Halloween was so powerful in the series that I kind of just assumed they were all around there. Until I went back and reread and was like,
a lot of it does take place in cold months, so you might be lumping those together. But some of them also take place in hot months.
Because it was something
about his coat a lot.
Yeah.
With the dynamics of Reservations at 8 is I wanted it to be winter, but I had to figure out a time that it wasn't Christmas. I didn't want it to be lumped in as a Christmas love story. I just wanted to.
It's immediately not Christmas.
Or February.
Yeah.
February is always like the coldest. Well, at least in New England, it's always like the freaking coldest
so choose
month.
Like January 20th, and it's the furthest away you can be from Christmas and like
Valentine's Day.
Yeah, and it's cold as shit.
Right. Well, so I was kind of thinking about it of like, okay, what day do I want to put it on? Because I actually did want it in December. I wanted it leading up to Christmas because emotions change and things like that. So I was like, okay, last day of the semester. That's when this happens, which tends to be like the first,
the 8th, or
5th to 10th of December, depending on the calendar and your cycle and everything. So I was like, okay, this is good.
In my military story, I decided that all this shit happening in the first book is going to happen on the finals week of the fall semester just to frustrate one of the side characters.
Nice.
And to go with the unintended consequence that hinders a book is, particularly with Rowling in the first 6 Harry Potters, because it's set at a school.
Yes.
Every climax has to happen in finals. It's just the structure. It has to happen that way.
Yep.
And it can be really stupid.
Yeah, the unintended consequence of location-based dates.
Mm-hmm. I mean, they can be good and bad, these consequences. It's just things that you need to take.
But it's also, maybe for the writer, having that structure of, of a semester beginning, because that breaks nicely into about 3 or 4 chunks. That might give you a structure to write around that just helps you out.
It lets you move the story along. Like, you don't have to feel the minutia with what's going on. He's at school. You know what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So you can just highlight the moments that you need to
highlight. And that's kind of something I was thinking about in terms of unintended consequences of the positive unintended consequence of placing your story in familiar settings. There's a lot of things like that Dresden doesn't have to explain because it's in modern day Chicago. History is pretty much the same. He can tweak events, but the majority of history, we as the reader just assume is the same.
One of my favorite things that Dresden gets to do is make snide pop culture snarks. And some of them are really good, but you just don't get to do that regularly if you're writing fantasy.
Right. Or sci-fi for that matter.
Yeah. Like, he gets to get away with so many little jabs at people. There was one that I read in particular that was just great, but I can't remember it anymore.
Well, let's see, my favorite was in Small Favor. Harry and Thomas get into Thomas's gigantic car Humvee thing, and he says, "We're going to the place where I'm all powerful," it says Dresden or something. I don't remember the exact words. And then Thomas says, "We're going to Burger King." Thomas had some great lines.
And then there, like, a thing I run into, especially it's sort of an unintended consequences of sci-fi. Corlex is based in our world just down the line, about 500 years in the future. So, what pop culture references am I able to deem as worthy enough to have lasted 500 years? Because there's so much from the pop culture from 500 years ago that we still use today. Shakespeare, I don't know if Shakespeare is 500 years, but he was a while. There's Shakespeare greatly influenced our language, and there's a lot of imagery from his plays that we still use in our normal culture. So I'm like, okay, at what point is Star Trek still going to be like a thing? Like, or is whoever high going to be doing a plucky rendition of Best of Both Worlds from Star Trek: The Next Generation in 500 years? Like, what is going to be considered fine art? And you have to so that's one of those weird world building consequences of doing something in our universe in the future. Because you're like, what? How does you got to extrapolate how today is going to affect way down the line?
Yeah.
Is someone going to accuse something of jumping the shark or?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so it's just there's all these different things you gotta do, and then you can run into different theories, like I have about what I call social stagnation that I'm actually trying to work into Corlex. So my idea is that as society becomes more and more videotaped, i.e., we can watch more and more things from 20, 30, 40 years ago, societal evolution slows down. So maybe because this is where I got it from. So if you watch the first episode of Friends and the last episode of Friends, the dress, a lot of it, styles really change. But if you watch the first episode of How I Met Your Mother and the last episode of How I Met Your Mother, dress styles are really similar. Yeah, there's some changes, but it's not nearly as noticeable as from early 90s to early 2000s, then from mid 2000s mid to late 2000s to middle 2010s. So I've got this feeling that as we progress as a society and we can watch more and more old pop culture, our culture will start to stagnate in terms of change. It's just a theory, but so it's something I'm working with.
Episode.
Do what?
We're on a philosophical episode.
Apparently.
You did remind me of, and it was obviously something the writers were deliberately doing, but the last episode of Seinfeld is basically a parade of people accusing the four main characters of all the wrongdoings. Like every episode from the series, all those characters that they had wronged during the course of the series come back and hunt them in the whole Good Samaritan thing. And it's just funny that you had an entire series and you end on it by showing the unintended,
just how terrible they were.
Yeah, the unintended consequence of you were really shitty to all these people, and now look where it gets you.
Mm-hmm. That was kind of, they did something similar in Scrubs, the real finale with Zach Braff, not the whole bullshit medical school thing. But the more I watch that shit, the more I watch Seinfeld, because I'm on my first watch of Seinfeld, about season 5.5 or so. The more I'm like, oh wow, Scrubs borrowed a lot from this show, more than a lot of shows. But
Seinfeld is great.
It's okay.
Bye.
I'm gonna do slight topic change.
Okay.
Let's see. In terms of world building, I know this cool little thing about Dresden was that in the beginning, Jim Butcher had no idea about the wizard healing faster or better type idea. No, that was pointed out to him by a fan who was a nurse and says, do you have any idea how long it would take to recover from the injuries he's gotten? He's been shot in both hips and shoulders, and he would be in rehab for months and months. And so he just created the wizard healing thing.
Not to mention the cumulative long-term degenerative effect of all those.
Right.
Yeah. So
the number of concussions he's had.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. You kind of need to make up an excuse.
That's why it had the explanation in Deadbeat. I don't know when he actually came up with that, but I do know that he didn't intend it in the beginning. Someone pointed out to him, it's like, you need to like cover that little detail. And he did.
I mean, the world was practically built to be able to explain that.
Practically. Just because Harry needs to get hurt a ton every single time.
Right.
And still be ready to go the next time.
Yeah, I mean, Dresden's a good. I mean, granted, I'm a fan, but I'm not like super fan. But Dresden's a really good example of stopping at a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that the magic in the world is just manipulating these natural forces and other things. But how that works is never really explained. It's kind of like the Force before the whole stupid metachlorian things. It just was. And at certain points with some of the stuff with writing, it just has to be in either you accept the premise or you don't, and that determines how much you like the series.
Yeah.
Why'd you bring up the M word?
The what word? Magic?
M word. No, the other M word. Midichlorians.
Oh.
I know another little tidbit about world building. That's not Dresden, but it was from the Kingkiller Chronicles. It was actually from this interview that Jim Butcher and Patrick Rothfuss did to each other that I learned both these tidbits from. It was great. So the first book of the Kingkiller Chronicles was like 99% done. And Rothfuss had given it to a beta reader. And he pointed out that, lutes usually had 2 sets of strings just in case one broke. But strings breaking actually became a very big plot point in the middle of that in the character's development and stuff. So Rothfuss had a panic attack, and he had to make that there's a special type of lute that he was using that doesn't have second set of strings. He described like his whole body went covered in cold sweat.
Yeah, that's like 3 throwaway lines though to get away with it. When you're in fantasy,
yeah, and
do anything.
Only that guy would know that was wrong. It's like he kind of the way he described it was just like an offhand remark of, by the way, lutes were usually a little different than you thought.
This is the problem. The unintended consequence of trying to be a fantasy writer is you feel like you have to be an expert in every single category of things in the world there is to possibly talk about.
Yeah.
That is...
It's both a curse and it's also really, really
my
fun.
worst curse when it comes to world building is like not doing something because I need to stop and go and research it enough to figure out if I'm getting it right or not.
Yeah.
That takes way too much time.
Yes, it can.
I haven't even... with the whole Carlin story and the plague and figuring that out, like I'm afraid to actually figure it out because the medicine might be completely wrong and I don't want to become a doctor.
You have to go to medical school.
That's why you got to start making friends.
True.
One thing I have noticed in terms of that, if you put it especially if you research just some of the right hashtags, you can kick out a question on Twitter or Instagram, and you'll have professional, doctors and stuff get to you and talk to you about it because they want to be right. So that's one that's one place I've used Twitter.
I mean, that's the beauty of the Ask Historians on Reddit is those moderators are extremely
strict
on what they let be put as an answer.
Mm-hmm.
Like the number of times I've gone into a thread that is on my front page and there's no answer and the moderators are just yeah, nothing was good enough.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was there. I'll have to check those
really
out.
Good information when you get the right answers. It's fantastic. I've been fascinated by topics. I think one of them was textiles in the 1600s, but it's so well sourced. It's fascinating.
Right. Mm-hmm. Another fun sort of world building unintended consequence. Remember the show Family Matters from the 90s with Urkel and everything? Urkel was supposed to be in 1 or 2 episodes, period. And he was not supposed to be a part of the show, but he did so well in the demos when they when it hit and all the other things that they had to write him into the show. So be careful you don't make the characters you want to kill too likable, or you'll have to write them into your story for longer than you want to.
Well, if you're trying to maintain a profit instead of drive people to tears.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like that's always a risk when you're trying to introduce one-off characters, but you still want them to be interesting.
Yeah, because you want the death to hurt.
Mm.
We're not necessarily talking about characters that get murdered.
Well,
but just
but
introducing any side characters for a limited amount of time.
But you got to run like there's this really weird fine line in terms of like side characters and like little characters is too much detail versus no detail. Because forever and still is, Boba Fett is one of the most popular characters in Star Wars, and for 30 years there was nothing out there about him.
He had 3 lines.
Was he? Yeah. It was, so it's just that really weird, like the mystery making people like them, you know.
Also,
so
they probably should have had his death be more apparent on screen, so they wouldn't have to retcon it later because no one wanted him to be dead.
Right. but that is one of those, like the unintended consequence of like that kind of thing where you're just like, well, what do we do now? You know, you've killed this person, but the fans don't want him to be dead, so maybe he's dead, or we don't know.
And then they ruined him when they gave him a backstory in the original trilogy, in the prequel trilogy.
You know what people do when authors are like, well, what do we do now? They have babies.
Oh man, I hate it. I hate the child. Okay, and there are certain times where it's done really well. There are certain times where and most of the time it's done really poorly. I know I've ranted about this a bit, but we're going to keep going in it. So Gilmore Girls, they added a child in the last season that was, or it was right around the end. It was either the last season that was aired before the Netflix stuff or near the end, right around the end of the original run. They added this mysterious love child to throw a wrench in the Luke and Lorelai relationship, and it was just there for that shit, and I hated it. I quit watching. I was like, nope, I'm out. But in other things where the child is used in more organic, real ways, like well, I'm going to have to stop using Dresden because we use it way too much. But like in Frasier, Raj, she has a baby partway through the series. And it's not like she still does. It's life-changing, but in a real way. Like her job is still there. She's got to do all these things. She's still trying to flirt and all these other things. And the baby starts sort of getting in the way. But it doesn't really change her personality too much. So that was a good way to use a child. Like it was planned for.
Is that our first Frasier reference on the show?
I think so.
Damn. Nice.
I love me some Frasier. I'm
watching through it the first time right now. So like I know very little, but it's been pretty fun.
Yes, it's really good. The last like season and a half are kind of meh, but it's really good. It's also super weird watching that show like on Netflix because, as you're binging through it, you go through like 2 or 3 years and the characters reference, oh, that was 3 years ago, but for you it was like last week, or 2 weeks ago or whatever. So, but I enjoy that show a lot.
I mean, so babies that come out of nowhere to create conflict can be fun. As long as it's not too contrived.
Anything that comes out of nowhere to create conflict.
Yeah, but babies I mean, they can change. They tend to overchange the dynamic, or in a way that doesn't make sense. Like in Dresden, him being overly protective because he was an orphan makes a lot of sense. And so him being, and we've already seen him, he talks at length about how he, woman in distress he'll always be there to help her and do something stupid to help her. So it's not just his, it's a girl. I think the dynamic would be different if it was a boy. Like, yeah, it's a girl who's in trouble, that it's his child, and all these things that his blind spots actually make sense, but
that ticked every single blind spot, I think.
Right. It just, so that makes sense where a lot of times, it comes out of the blue, and in a lot of times when I see it, it's the characters react stupidly in a way that they've never really acted towards each other.
Like,
and that's what causes the conflict. Like Luke in Gilmore Girls, I'll just use this as an example. He's always really straightforward with Lorelai. Always. Just that's kind of his shtick as a character. He's just right, But when this mysterious daughter of his shows up, he starts lying to her about it. It's like, if he had just told her the truth from word go, this wouldn't be an issue. But it was so out of context in that character for him, it didn't make sense. Like, if he had been lying to her the entire time, sure, it makes sense. But
is there anything worse than like excessive conflict caused by failures to communicate properly? Especially when it comes to characters who communicate well in other situations.
It's so fucking tropey. Yeah. Like, that is like one of the biggest pet peeve tropes of me, and you see it a lot, especially in like sitcoms. But I just it kills me. Or when just like people just become too stupid. Like, they're really intelligent, really smart, and I've seen it. I've seen it with people and their kids, and they get just like really weird about it. But for the most part, people don't. At least from who the people I've been around, and so like they just get stupid weird about their kids, and I don't like that trope either.
And yet, that one's really true.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Like, I've seen it both ways, but more often than not, most of the people I know, they didn't like they're obviously different, but it's not like this huge fundamental personality shift. And you see that a lot in like TV and writing and that kind of crap.
So I think it's a normal thing that people can do for something that, since it's a huge life change, it could be a huge personality change depending on the person. But if you do that to a character in a story, you're at risk of turning off all of your followers.
Right.
Because they're no longer the person we wanted.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of the big unintended risk of that. Is like, if you make that huge change out of nowhere,
right, then it's got to be logical. Like in Dresden, his change, while extreme, makes sense. You can have extreme changes if you've been building up those personality traits in them. Mm-hmm. And so maybe even though it seems extreme, maybe it isn't, because you've established it as a possibility. But
I've read books essentially of a character in particular slowly going insane because of the choices he was making. And they're very small increments, but the first page to the last page is drastically different.
Mm-hmm.
But that's okay because it was showing the slow changes.
A great example of that is Rand al'Thor in The Wheel of Time, and how, because of who he is, he starts off as a freaking sheep herder.
Yep.
And by the end of the book, he's contemplating destroying the world in a fit of rage. And but it took him a long time to get there. It's a very slow progression of building insanity, caused by both his decisions and decisions forced on him.
Mm-hmm.
But
it's a good this is a good example of the Overton window. Are you all familiar with that psychological concept?
No.
So it's the idea that arguments, in society, they can only take place within a certain scope. So, imagine a window so anything outside the window is deemed too extreme. But you can slowly move the window through discourse and other things to where you've moved it so far one direction or the other, however you want to look at it, that what used to be considered in the middle and normal is now considered extreme. So you can do that with your characters, where if you slowly inch them along from normal to psychopath, once you get to the psychopath, that normal it doesn't even work anymore because it's not in the window.
Mm-hmm. That
that
does make a lot of sense, especially for characters.
right.
And
It's one of those things where you look at it and like, okay, I mean, I think where originally developed was in like political discourse, and you can see it now.
Oh God, yeah.
Like if you were
it
to
sounds
like
right.
look back at like Bill Clinton's presidency, he'd be a hardcore Republican now. You know, like a lot of his stuff would be considered right wing because both political parties' windows have shifted so much. But that's how
But I mean,
when you're looking at moving characters, you got to stay in this window.
but if you compare, say, American politics to European politics, our entire window is skewed far to the
Yes.
right. So it depends on
Mm.
like your characters can across the story be in completely different windows.
Right,
Mhm.
but when the reader looks at the character, they have that window around them because how the window's been you've built the window of their perception. So you can't yank that window too hard without jolting the reader and maybe turning them off.
And that's what I like, especially in sitcoms or like the Gilmore Girls example, is like, we don't know what to do. We need to create more shit. So everything's getting jerked in one direction way too hard and too fast. That's what happened with the child. And when babies happen in various stories, it can be that. I don't think it was that in Dresden just because it was so planned.
Dresden felt like you were staring through the exact same window.
Yes.
Right.
Like it was.
Even though if you go back and read, you realize how much the window has shifted.
Yes,
Yeah.
and it has shifted and it's been highlighted a lot of times. But you can see where and when and how far it's been shifted.
Mhm.
And that's like you have that progression so everything feels natural. But, child appearing out of nowhere with no warning and then characters acting stupid, that's when it's bad.
To be fair, it wasn't a baby.
Yeah.
It was just like, remember 6 years ago? Yeah, that was actually a kid. Sorry, I didn't tell you.
Well, I mean, just inside baseball, like Gilmore Girls, like that last season, they had like fired the writers and the original creators, so it was like brand new writers, and that's when you get all
That makes sense.
My favorite story like that, though, is from Star Trek: Best of Both Worlds. So the main writing crew for Star Trek: Next Generation was in this really bad contract talk, and so what they did, because they didn't think they were going to get rehired, is they wrote the first half of Best of Both Worlds, which is the one where Picard gets captured by the Borg, etc. Thinking, look, we're going to give the next writing crew something impossible to write out of. And then they got rehired. So they had to dig out of the hole they created.
Interesting.
So there's an unintended consequence of
I've been watching through Next Generation, like the first season, like pretty much for the first time. I have no real idea of what's going on.
Mhm.
And I've noticed a trend in some of the writing that if Gene Roddenberry was directly involved, I kind of don't like it.
Well, here the
My love
first
story with Star Wars.
yes. But the first two seasons were a lot of original series scripts that they repurposed because of how it was weird how the writing was done. But that's why a lot of people say Star Trek: The Next Generation gets really good in season 3 because that's when they started becoming completely original scripts.
And same thing with The Office and Parks and Rec, where they both flourished once they stopped trying to mimic for The Office, the British one, or Parks and Rec. The first season is way too similar to The Office in feel and tone, and
Right.
once they abandon that and let the characters flourish, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's okay to not try to imitate something else.
It's okay to draw inspiration from something and then breathe new life into it in a completely different direction. I'm trying to think. There's stories that do that. And I mean, I would throw out Wheel of Time. I just started rereading the first book for, I think, the third time now. And like, the first book is really, really Lord of the Rings inspired. And that was what was selling at the time Robert Jordan wrote the book. But once he gets beyond that and sort of abandons the formula of Lord of the Rings, it gets so much better.
Right. And you do see that in a lot of first books that they're like, okay, I need to get something that is popular. So
Sellable. Yeah.
they write it, and then once you start getting into the world where they're established, they can do more of their own thing, you see that a bit more.
Yeah, like when I think the very first bad person that shows up on the screen in Wheel of Time is a black cloaked rider.
Nice.
He makes them interesting, but at the same time, it's a ringwraith on page. Like that's just what it is in reality, and that's the danger. But I mean, it was what was selling. So
Right.
Well, then that
also,
has
dark cloaked riders are so much fun.
unintended consequence of like, I didn't want to continue reading Wheel of Time because it was the same as everything else had been. When you are that derivative, it's just
a lot better.
I know what the feel is. Like I'm not interested in this anymore.
I'd say halfway through the first book really kicks off.
I had no interest in the second book of the more travel because I'm pretty sure towards the last page of the first book was like, we have to travel on the other side of the world. It's like, fuck you.
That's fantasy. We travel everywhere.
Not necessarily. It's okay to just, stay in one spot, like a
look
city.
At Tristan.
Like,
Sure, he's still in the same city, but he's still running across the city all day long.
But that takes an hour, not a year.
Yeah. Right. Well, her issue is
quick enough.
You don't mind the traveling. You mind the
Minutia.
Plotting, writing of traveling.
Yes.
Right.
So either make the traveling interesting or skip over the traveling.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Wheel of Time did try to make the traveling interesting. I do remember, like, they ran into like wolves and gypsies, and at one point religious zealots and stuff like that. But it's just, I need to get from A to B and I need a bunch of obstacles, and so they're just random obstacles. They didn't mean things.
Couldn't that just be the description of plotting a book?
Those obstacles should be important. Things to slow them down.
Okay, so you mentioned wolves, gypsies, and crazy religious people.
I know the wolves stick around.
The wolves are extremely important. The gypsies are extremely important, and the religious people are extremely important.
They did not feel that way.
And that's a shortcoming then in Robert Jordan's attempt to interest you. But all three of those are very important in the long run, particularly the wolves.
I know the wolves stick around. I didn't know about the other stuff.
The gypsies, particularly one of the gypsies you meet, comes back for a long time. And the religious people have their own subplot. One of my favorite subplots, actually. He does a decent job in the first book of introducing a lot of the major players.
Okay.
Which is one of the things I think Dresden does well. He mentions a lot of things early on that come back later.
Yeah. It's one thing that he tries to do right, because if you foreshadow it early, it's not a surprise later. It's not good for it to be a total surprise. So in his first books, you do notice that he's stretching, like, it's a little bit more whimsical in order to try to explain and set the standards of normal things of the world.
I was going to mention when we were talking about minute details, the danger of that in Chekhov's gun, where if you spend too much time describing details, your readers are going to expect it to come back.
Yes.
So if you spend a long time describing someone's coat, people expect that coat to mean something later. But if you're writing a fantasy series and you just do passing detail on things as you go, it makes a hell of a lot more coherent story in the long run when you bring those things back up later.
Mm-hmm. I'm kind of struggling with the amount of detail I want to put in for the Victorian stories, like, because some of the details I really enjoy, and then it's like, are they important? I don't know yet.
That's one of the things with Malazan and how he is so averse to detail at times, is that it is all in the background and it exists, but he only tells you when it's relevant. So you can world build and design all these things you want to show and then not reveal them to the reader until
until they're important.
until they're important.
Yeah. And then I'm just kind of like, because I'm at a stage of research of like, do I want to make it important? And that becomes questionable.
I do particularly like in Malazan how in the second book he has the people be rescued by this magical world traveling, hopping trade guild that comes out of nowhere and saves them. And then in the third book that happens parallel with the second one, he shows them setting it up. And it's interesting.
Yeah, okay.
But kind of the opposite of throw something at you and then explain it later, which can also work.
Apparently it did.
It can. Or toss something at you that seems unimportant and make it relevant later.
Right. I mean, for certain things, if you know it's important, sort of like the flashback or something, then you're more apt to pay attention to it because you know it's important. It might be more minutia, more detailed, like setting something up or how certain things happen, but you know it's important, so you pay attention to it. So if you're doing that without that context, you got to figure out a way to make it feel important. You don't know how it's going to be, affecting the series, but it's got to affect the series somehow, and you got to make it feel like it's important.
And that does, when it comes to structuring a story, if you do a flashback, you can bet your readers are going to be paying attention because the flashback tends to, like, you wouldn't do a flashback if it wasn't going to be important.
Right. I don't know. I never know how to do flashbacks right. Like, that is one of those things, like, every time I do one, I feel dirty when I do it. But even though it's not a bad thing, it's just...
How many flashbacks do we have in Dresden?
Ghost Story.
I mean, that's an entire book.
Ghost Story.
Which part of Ghost Story?
There's very few just like legit flashbacks. It's just like explaining what happened.
Yeah. I mentioned this.
Like in Ghost Story, in order for him to do his magic, he needed to work on his memories. So he was actually going through his memories to do it. So there's bits and pieces of that. Like the first time he was able to do the fire spell, then there's the fight with Justin and those things. Those are genuine flashbacks.
Oh, right. Oh, God, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But, I mean, then there's a lot of times when not in a real flashback that you're getting memories. And it's okay to show the memories because people reminisce.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's just a really yeah.
I forgot how I mentioned this to Jacob, but how frustrating, for me at least, I have issues with Skin Game in that he hides a major plot point in a flashback that happens after the fact.
Yeah, that's a genuine flashback.
It's a genuine flashback that hides the entire key to the story that happens after he implements the key.
I do like rereading it, then going like all the times, like, oh, now I know the code of how they're talking.
I mean, that code is extremely simple.
Works.
It kind of. But it's frustrating to hide important details.
He hides important details like that all the time.
Dresden does that all the time.
Yeah.
I was going to say...
Turncoat and...
What's the one with White Knight when he skimps on the conversation between Dresden and Marcone, and then Marcone shows up. But there was a conversation, so when he does show up and it's Marcone, that's what he talked about.
The same thing when in Turncoat, when Harry's talking to Ebenezer, and it's like, I think this is what's going on, but you don't get to know that until like an hour later.
Yeah. But then he doesn't do that
all the time.
Like I'm kind of surprised, like if they had done that in Skin Game where he just said to Mab, hey, I've got something I gotta do before I go to Nicodemus's. And then the next chapter is him going to Nicodemus's, something happened, but I don't remember that happening.
It might have. Well, no, I think it was just Mab beating the shit out of him, and then he arrives at Murphy's. So
yeah, it's weird that Butcher did that when he's done it so well in the past.
I think it still worked.
It frustrated me.
And for the Dresden Files podcast, please.
Hey, last time High Fantasy infected Dresden. We're taking turns.
Hey, we talked. I was going to say we talked about High Fantasy. It's okay. What do we have?
Unintended consequences of having multiple podcasts.
Yes. It's just. I mean, I think we've hit pretty much everything we need to hit before we start.
No, we haven't done Mistborn at all.
No.
Oh, well. And I haven't gotten my obligatory Director Alex stabbing somebody reference, so I guess the streak is broken.
I did hit on
Murders.
not every introduced character is there to be murdered.
Murder.
Not every one-off character has to die. They can just leave or just not come back.
Ooh, one thing I do want to throw out there as a viewing recommendation is Into the Fucking World on Netflix. Really good.
Okay, I've seen the ads for it.
Really dark. But it's like 8 episodes, so you can
Okay.
it's 8 20-minute episodes, so you can bust it out in like an evening pretty easily. But it's really good. But yeah, you kind of get kicked in the teeth a little bit at the end. But yeah, it's worth watching.
Okay.
Another, actually, that would be a show about unintended consequences. So there is a major plot point in like the 3rd or 4th episode that has major ramifications for the rest. Like he did the right thing, but had major ramifications for the rest of the show. So good watch on how to like showing how doing the right thing can also be a negative and have negative consequences.
And to go back to Mistborn, where they spend the entire book talking about how the Lord Ruler did the wrong thing with keeping the power for himself. And when Rin gets the power, she's like, I'm going to do the right thing and release it. Oh, shit, it's an actually evil demon spirit thing.
Yeah. I mean, even before that, like, when they did describe what the Lord Ruler did with the power when he had it at the first point, he wanted to save the planet. Like, it was too cold. It was too far away from the sun. So he moved it closer to the sun, but he moved it too far close. So then it was burning everything. So he created the mists that dominated the geography in order to stop the burning.
And that's one of like the key plot points in Wheel of Time is the people in the ancient history accidentally. So you have the creator who imprisoned the Dark Lord at the beginning of time in a prison, and the people in the high period of magic ancient history accidentally bore into that prison searching for more power. And there's like, wow, there's a big source of power in there. We're going to go look for it. And they broke into his prison, which let the Dark Lord reach out and affect things. But then what happened was the male hero of it in the past went to the prison to try to patch it, and using the male side of the magic attempted to do it. But what that let happen was the Dark Lord tainted the male source, which means men go crazy if they can use magic. So in the first book, when Rand can use magic, spoiler, you already have a timeline that he'll go crazy.
That's fun, though.
It is fun. It's particularly fun from his point of view because it doesn't seem crazy, but he's definitely a little crazy. And getting crazier as it goes. But that was one hell of a unintended consequence when, we're going to go fight the Dark Lord. No women will join us, just men. They show up and doom creation, and all men do go mad. If they can use magic.
Cool.
Do we have anything else to add with this episode?
Not that I can think of right now. I'm sure we'll have unintended consequences part 18 somewhere down the road.
Time turners.
Yeah, you're just going to throw
explanation for that. Then
time turners.
A lot of our old podcasts, actually.
I could go like off on Harry Potter and unintended consequences, or stupid decisions that led to stupid things.
The entire 4th book and Harry and Ron's fight that seemed to just be, we're not going to talk about this.
Or, Voldemort just not throwing the child out the window instead of there's 1,000 ways for a very grown man to kill a child, and he went with the one way that wouldn't work.
Well, yeah, but he went with the one way that he always does things. That makes sense.
Still.
Unintended consequence of being who you are, you're fucked.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Unintended consequence of dying for your child. He lives.
Yep.
Well, that's an intended consequence.
She didn't really think about that when it happened.
But she knew the charm would protect him.
I don't think she did when she died.
I think that was part of it. Like, she was very skilled in charms. That was one of the things about her.
I don't remember did she intentionally die? No,
Not
I'm still confused at if that's the case, then didn't James die for her and Harry?
But he didn't cast the charm. She did.
I don't think it takes you don't have to cast it. It just happens.
I don't remember enough of these details.
I don't think it's an actual charm. It's just the way love magic works.
Yeah, that's kind of.
This was something that was explained in the 7th book. I only read that one once.
No. I do like how he uses that to protect the entire Hogwarts staff and student body. That seems a little excessive for a charm, but
whatever works, right?
it did give us the most badass moment in the books. When Neville cut the head of the snake off. It's still my favorite scene.
Oh, yeah. Neville's awesome. He's my favorite character.
Oh, God, yeah.
There's an entire nerdcore rap song based on Neville. Oh, it's for reals.
I did just listen to the F Plus episode where they did the computer generated Harry Potter chapter.
Oh, I haven't listened to that one.
Oh my God. Oh dear God.
There's a lot of Harry Potter in F Plus, and that is because of
the unintended consequence of using a lot of the same language when you're writing your books is if a computer is going to generate a story, you're going to get some really backward sounding things going on because you use this phrase so often the computer's going to just use it.
Yeah.
Even if it doesn't work.
So
cool.
I do think we've run out of topics.
For now.
You can find us at brokenjars.xyz. You can find me on Twitter at Jacob Ingalls. You can, what else can you do? You can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/brokenjars. You can do all sorts of cool stuff to interact with us if you want to. I much recommend you do so. These jokers don't do anything on social media, so don't get your hopes up.
I'm on Discord.
If you want to give us a couple bucks a month, hop on Discord and chat with us because we're always kind of around. Even when I'm not around, I'm around. I have the notifications on my phone, so someone posts something, all right.
Discord is a great tool.
Yeah, it's been pretty fun.
Yeah, it is. So, you can check out my other podcast, Great Scott, which is about The Office. We are in the middle of season 7, so we have got a pretty good back catalog if you want to check out that. The Dresden Files podcast, which features director Alex, and last episode also featured Cullen.
We talked about Lovecraft. It was fun.
I don't know what other shows we have going right now.
Dangerous to Go Alone, I assume.
I think that's still a thing. But so you can do that and check us out. Say hi. You can email us at brokenjarsbroadcasting@gmail.com. We actually got some fan mail the other day. It was very exciting.
Nice.
Everyone was excited. So
this is going on a long time.
We will see y'all next time.
Thanks for joining.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.